The year was 1065, and England stood as a land of wealth and opportunity, but also a kingdom teetering on the edge of uncertainty. Under the reign of Edward the Confessor, the Anglo-Saxon realm had enjoyed relative peace, but his rule was marred by one glaring issue: he had no heir. This single problem would ignite a fierce struggle for the throne and alter the course of history. Edward was a pious king, more focused on religion than securing the future of his realm. His court was rife with rival factions: powerful Anglo-Saxon earls like Harold Godwinson, foreign influences from Normandy, and the ever-looming presence of Scandinavian raiders. England's throne was a glittering prize, and many watched with hungry eyes. Among the contenders was Harold Godwinson, the Earl of Wessex, and the most powerful man in England. Harold had the support of the Witan, the Council of Nobles, but his ambitions came with risks. Across the English Channel in Normandy, Duke William believed he was the rightful heir, claiming Edward had promised him the throne. Adding to the tension, Harold had once sworn an oath, allegedly under duress, to support William's claim. The plot thickened when Edward the Confessor died in January 1066. Despite the controversy, Harold moved swiftly, seizing the throne and being crowned king. But Harold's decision set the stage for what would become one of the most turbulent years in British history. As England crowned Harold, the storm clouds of conflict gathered. Far to the north, a Viking king was preparing his own claim, while across the sea, William of Normandy sharpened his plans for invasion. With Harold Godwinson crowned king, his reign faced immediate threats from two formidable challengers. The prize was England's throne, but the stakes were far greater: a chance to shape the destiny of a nation. The first threat loomed in the icy north. Harald Hardrada, the fearsome king of Norway, was no stranger to conquest. A legendary warrior, he claimed the English throne through an agreement made decades earlier with a previous king. Known as the last great Viking, Hardrada was determined to bring England under his banner. His reputation as a brutal and cunning leader preceded him, and he rallied a mighty Norse fleet for an invasion. But the challenge from the south was no less formidable. Across the English Channel, Duke William of Normandy was assembling his forces. A master tactician and ambitious ruler, William believed his claim to the throne was divinely ordained. He had secured the blessing of Pope Alexander II, turning his invasion into a holy cause. With knights, archers, and ships gathered from across Normandy and beyond, William prepared for the greatest gamble of his life. Harold Godwinson, trapped between two invaders, faced an impossible challenge. To the north, Hardrada's fleet sailed toward England's shores. To the south, William's forces waited for the right moment to strike. Harold's kingdom was strong, but his resources were stretched thin. The storm was brewing, and soon, England would become a battlefield. The decisions Harold made in the coming months would determine whether he could hold his fragile kingdom together or watch it fall into chaos. In September 1066, the first strike came not from William of Normandy, but from the icy north. King Harald Hardrada, the fearsome Viking ruler, had arrived with a vast fleet of over 300 ships, carrying thousands of hardened warriors. His ally, Tostig Godwinson, Harold's own exiled brother, joined him, adding betrayal to the looming threat. Together, they set their sights on York, an Anglo-Saxon stronghold. The Viking army quickly overwhelmed local forces, claiming victory at the Battle of Fulford. With York seemingly within their grasp, Hardrada and Tostig believed the path to the throne was open. But their triumph was short-lived, for Harold Godwinson moved with a speed that no one expected. Leaving southern England vulnerable to William's invasion, Harold made a daring gamble. Gathering his troops, he marched his army nearly 200 miles north in less than a week, a feat of endurance that demonstrated both his leadership and the resolve of his men. On September 25th, Harold and his army confronted the Vikings at Stamford Bridge. Hardrada, expecting only negotiations, was caught completely off guard. The Vikings, unarmored and unprepared, scrambled to defend themselves as Harold launched a full assault. The battle raged fiercely. One legendary Norse warrior held the bridge alone, cutting down dozens of Saxons before finally being slain. Hardrada, true to his warrior spirit, died leading his men. Tostig fell alongside him, sealing his betrayal with his life. By the end of the day, the Viking army was utterly defeated, and only a few ships returned to Norway. As Harold Godwinson celebrated his hard-fought victory at Stamford Bridge, news arrived that shattered the moment. William of Normandy had landed on England's southern shores, and he wasn't wasting time. His forces, well prepared and bolstered by knights and archers from across Europe, had established a foothold at Pevensey. From there, they began raiding the countryside, a deliberate move to provoke Harold into action. Despite the exhaustion of his troops, Harold had no choice but to act. Leaving behind the blood-soaked fields of Stamford Bridge, he ordered his men on another grueling march, this time to the south. The pace was brutal. His soldiers, already fatigued from their previous battle, struggled to keep up. Still, Harold pushed forward, determined to defend his kingdom. Meanwhile, William fortified his position, carefully planning his next steps. Unlike Harold, who was racing against time, William had the luxury of preparation. He built castles, secured supply lines, and ensured his army was well fed and rested. He knew Harold would come, and he intended to dictate the terms of their confrontation. When Harold reached London, he was met with a critical decision. His advisors urged caution, suggesting he gather reinforcements before facing the Normans. But Harold, confident in his troops and eager to protect his realm, chose to march directly to Hastings. It was a fateful choice, driven as much by pride as necessity. By the time Harold's forces arrived near Hastings, they were weary and outnumbered. Yet they held one advantage: the high ground at Senlac Hill. Harold's army formed a strong defensive position, ready to meet the Norman invaders. The two armies now stood poised for a battle that would decide England's future. October 14th, 1066. The fields near Senlac Hill awoke to the clamour of war. Harold Godwinson's army, though exhausted, held a strong defensive position atop the hill. Below, Duke William's Norman forces prepared for a battle that would define the fate of England. The Saxons formed a tight shield wall, a formidable barrier of interlocked shields and spears. It was a proven tactic, one that had withstood countless assaults. Harold's men were outnumbered, but their resolve was unshakable. They fought for their homeland, their families, and their king. William, a seasoned commander, opened the battle with a barrage of arrows from his archers, but the Saxon shield wall held firm, and the Normans gained little ground. Frustrated, William ordered his infantry and cavalry to charge. The Normans surged up the hill, their knights on horseback crashing into the Saxon line. Yet again, the shield wall stood strong. Hours passed, and the battle hung in a deadly stalemate. Then came the first twist. A rumor spread among the Norman ranks that William had been killed. Panic erupted, and the army began to falter. But William, ever the strategist, removed his helmet and rode along the front lines, rallying his troops with cries of, "I live!" The Normans regained their composure and pressed on. As the day wore on, William resorted to a bold strategy. He feigned a retreat, luring part of Harold's forces down the hill in pursuit. It was a costly mistake for the Saxons. The Normans turned and slaughtered the pursuing troops, weakening the shield wall. The sun dipped lower, and the final moments of the battle approached. Harold, fighting alongside his men, refused to yield. But then, a single Norman arrow found its mark, striking Harold in the eye. The Saxon king fell, and with him, the last hope of his army. The battlefield at Senlac Hill was strewn with the bodies of the fallen. As night fell on October 14th, 1066, the Anglo-Saxon army lay broken, their king, Harold Godwinson, dead. For Duke William of Normandy, it was a hard-won victory, but his fight to claim England was far from over. William moved cautiously in the aftermath. He understood that conquering a kingdom required more than a single battle. With Harold gone, England's remaining nobles scrambled to regroup. Some supported Edgar Etheling, a young but inexperienced descendant of the Anglo-Saxon royal line. Others, weary of conflict, considered surrender. To secure his position, William began a march toward London, a deliberate and calculated campaign of dominance. Along the way, his forces burned villages and seized strongholds, demonstrating both his power and the consequences of resistance. At the same time, he offered clemency to those who submitted, a shrewd move to win allies among the Anglo-Saxon elite. By December, William reached London, and the remaining English nobles reluctantly accepted his rule. On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey. The ceremony, meant to symbolize unity, was marred by a misunderstanding. When the crowd outside cheered, Norman soldiers, thinking it was an uprising, set fire to nearby buildings. The uneasy blending of Norman and Anglo-Saxon cultures had begun. William's reign marked the beginning of sweeping changes. Norman rule introduced feudalism, reshaping England's social structure. Castles sprang up across the land, symbols of power and control. The Anglo-Saxon elite were replaced by Norman lords, and even the English language began to evolve under French influence. Yet, resistance lingered, and uprisings against Norman rule would follow. The Battle of Hastings was over, but the Norman conquest was only beginning. The Norman victory at Hastings may have crowned William as king, but it did not grant him uncontested rule. In the years that followed, England became a land of rebellion and transformation, as the full weight of Norman influence reshaped the nation's identity. William faced immediate resistance. The North, in particular, became a hotbed of defiance. Anglo-Saxon nobles and displaced landowners refused to accept Norman rule, sparking uprisings that threatened to undermine William's authority. The most notorious of these revolts came in 1069, when rebels, supported by Viking allies, captured the city of York. William responded with calculated ferocity. His infamous harrying of the north was a campaign of devastation. Villages were burned, crops destroyed, and thousands of people left to starve. The rebellion was crushed, but at a terrible cost. The north lay in ruin, and its people bore scars that would last generations. Beyond military campaigns, William solidified his rule through sweeping administrative changes. The introduction of the feudal system bound landowners directly to the king, ensuring loyalty through a rigid hierarchy. The Domesday Book, a comprehensive survey of England's lands and resources, became a tool of control and taxation. It also marked an unprecedented effort to document the wealth and structure of a kingdom. The cultural impact of the Norman conquest was equally profound. Norman architecture, characterized by imposing stone castles and grand cathedrals, transformed England's landscape. The English language, once rooted in Anglo-Saxon traditions, began absorbing French influences, evolving into the rich tapestry of words we know today. Yet, even as William secured his grip on England, questions remained. Could the fragile unity he had forged endure? And how would the Norman conquest shape the kingdom in the centuries to come? The Norman conquest was not just a chapter in England's history, but a pivotal moment for Europe as a whole. The clash of cultures, the spread of feudalism, and the reordering of power networks had far-reaching effects. In the wake of 1066, William's influence extended beyond England's borders. As a vassal of the French king, he sought to strengthen his own position by expanding his holdings in France. The integration of Norman culture into the English and French courts created a new aristocracy, one that bridged the two cultures. This era marked the beginning of a shared European nobility, where alliances and marriages formed networks of power across the English Channel. William's descendants continued to play significant roles in European affairs. The Plantagenets, who rose to power in England, were not just Norman by ancestry, but shaped by the continental influences of their forebears. This cross-channel connection influenced everything from military strategies to governance, as rulers like Henry II expanded English territories in France and sought to consolidate power across their domains. The Norman conquest also had a lasting impact on the legal and administrative systems of Europe. William's introduction of a centralized feudal system of governance in England became a model for other kingdoms. In France, the system of parlement, regional courts where nobles and commoners could challenge the king's decisions, was partly influenced by Norman practices. The spread of Norman culture was equally transformative. The arts, language, and architecture flourished as Anglo-Norman styles became fashionable. Castles like the Tower of London were not just symbols of conquest, but also tools of control and administration. They represented the power of the king and the consolidation of Norman rule in a land where traditions and languages were intertwined and at times in conflict. Through the legacy of the Norman conquest, England was transformed from a collection of small kingdoms into a centralized, powerful state. The conquest's impact was felt across Europe, shaping medieval Europe's political, social, and cultural landscape for centuries to come. The Norman conquest of 1066 was not just a momentary event, but the beginning of a transformative period for England and Europe. It set the stage for centuries of change, influencing everything from politics to culture, law to language. The consequences of William's victory at Hastings rippled through time, laying the groundwork for the medieval period and beyond. One of the most significant long-term impacts was the establishment of a centralized monarchy in England. Before 1066, England was a patchwork of regional rulers and local powers. William's victory established the king as the ultimate authority, with the ability to demand loyalty and service from the newly created Norman barons. This system, bolstered by the feudal system, allowed for greater control over the land and the people, transforming England from a decentralized kingdom to a powerful state in its own right. The integration of Anglo-Saxon and Norman cultures had lasting effects on the English language. The fusion of Germanic and Latin-based languages led to the creation of Middle English, which absorbed many French words and concepts. This language evolution reflected the melding of two distinct cultures, influencing everything from law and governance to literature and art. The works of the period, from the Bayeux Tapestry to the writings of Geoffrey Chaucer, were steeped in this bilingual legacy. The Norman conquest also set the stage for England's involvement in European conflicts, particularly the 100 Years' War. The Plantagenet kings, descendants of William's line, sought to assert control over French territories, leading to a series of wars that spanned more than a century. These conflicts not only defined the borders of England and France, but also shaped the social and economic fabric of both nations. The Norman influence persisted through these wars, as English kings continued to use their connections to the Norman aristocracy to bolster their claims on the continent. In the broader European context, the Norman conquest acted as a catalyst for the formation of a more interconnected and interdependent Europe. The movement of people, ideas, and goods across the English Channel created a cultural exchange that influenced art, architecture, and literature across the continent. It also set a precedent for European monarchs to intervene in the affairs of other nations, driven by dynastic claims and territorial ambitions. As we trace the legacy legacy of 1066, it is clear that the Norman conquest was not merely an isolated event. It marked the beginning of a new era in European history. The Norman conquest did more than change the political landscape of England. The introduction of Norman customs, laws, and traditions created a blend that would define medieval England. One of the most enduring legacies of the Norman conquest was the establishment of a centralized legal system. The Normans brought with them a sophisticated system of laws, including the concept of feudal tenure, which defined land ownership and service in terms of loyalty to the king. The introduction of the Domesday Book was a remarkable innovation in record-keeping and taxation. This survey of the kingdom's lands and resources allowed William to assess wealth, tax liabilities, and military capability. It was a tool of power and control, marking the first systematic record of England's resources. Over time, the judicial system evolved with the development of local courts, where Norman barons held court and enforced the king's laws. This system laid the foundation for England's common law system, which would later become a model for justice in Europe. The Norman conquest brought with it a rich cultural exchange. Norman architecture, art, and language began to dominate English society. Castles became symbols of Norman power, and they were constructed throughout the land, not just as fortifications, but as centers of administration. The architectural style known as Romanesque became widespread, characterized by thick stone walls, rounded arches, and sturdy construction. This style was adapted by the Anglo-Saxons, resulting in a unique blend that reflected the merging of cultures. In terms of language, the Norman conquest brought a fusion of Anglo-Saxon and French. French became the language of the court, of law, and of the aristocracy, continued to be spoken by the common people. Over the centuries, the two languages merged, enriching the English vocabulary with French-derived words, especially in law, government, and the arts. The Norman conquest also influenced the way the English viewed their own identity. The term English began to take on new meaning, blending Anglo-Saxon and Norman elements into a cohesive sense of nationality. William's victory at Hastings was celebrated not just as a personal triumph, but as the creation of a new unified England. The feudal system, although harsh and demanding, provided a sense of order and hierarchy that defined the realm. The language, customs, and traditions of the Normans became deeply ingrained in English society. The English church was reorganized under Norman bishops who introduced reforms and centralized control, further linking England with the broader Christian world. The idea of chivalry, brought by the Normans, also began to take root in English society, influencing the behavior of nobles and knights and the development of medieval literature and poetry. The Norman conquest was not just a turning point for England, but also for the medieval period as a whole. It set the stage for the development of feudalism, the church's influence, and the growth of towns and cities, transforming the social and economic landscape of Europe. It introduced a new system of land ownership and military service that redefined the relationship between the king and his nobles. William distributed land to his supporters in return for loyalty and service. This system created a network of dependency where lords provided protection and justice in exchange for the peasants' work on their land. This system of feudal tenure became the backbone of medieval European society. The rise of the manorial system was closely tied to the feudal system. Large estates were organized around a manor house where lords ruled. This system allowed the Normans to establish control over the population and extract resources efficiently. The castle, often located at the heart of these manors, became not just a defensive structure, but a center of governance and authority. The church played a pivotal role in the Norman conquest and its aftermath. The Normans brought with them a strong sense of Christian piety and a desire to establish the church's authority throughout England. The church became a tool of control for the new regime, spreading Norman culture and law through monasteries and religious institutions. Norman bishops were appointed to key sees, and the church was reorganized to mirror the feudal structure. This centralization helped to spread Christianity across the land, fostering a sense of unity among the populace. The church's role in education and administration increased as the Normans established cathedral schools and monastic libraries. These institutions became centers of learning, where scholars copied and preserved texts in Latin, including works of law, history, and theology that shaped the intellectual landscape of the medieval period. The Norman conquest also led to the growth of towns and cities, as the introduction of markets and trade brought wealth to different regions of England. William granted charters to towns, giving them rights and privileges in exchange for taxes and military service. These towns became the economic hubs of England, where craftsmen and merchants could trade goods, provide services, and accumulate wealth. Towns were often built near Norman castles or on the sites of former Anglo-Saxon settlements. The construction of castles and the rebuilding of towns encouraged population growth and economic expansion. As towns grew, they developed a sense of autonomy and identity, separate from the control of the feudal lords. The Norman conquest was part of a larger pattern of European expansion and conquest in the 11th and 12th centuries. The Norman Normans themselves, having originally come from Scandinavia and then settled in what is now France, were well positioned to become players on the European stage. Their conquest of England gave them a foothold in the British Isles and access to Ireland and Scotland. William's descendants continued to expand into France, creating the Duchy of Normandy as a powerful buffer state against Viking and French incursions. The Normans also launched expeditions to Italy and Sicily, where they established kingdoms that lasted for centuries. The concept of cross-channel alliances became common, with Norman dukes and kings frequently marrying into other European royal families. This web of connections helped shape the political landscape of medieval Europe. The physical remnants of the Norman conquest can still be seen in the architecture of castles and cathedrals across England. The Tower of London, built by William, stands as a symbol of Norman power and the consolidation of royal authority. The impact of the conquest is also visible in the British monarchy's continued interest in its Norman heritage, with the royal family tracing its lineage back to William. The Battle of Hastings in 1066 was not just a battle, but a moment that shaped the course of history. The Norman conquest brought England into the fold of a larger European network of power and influence. It was a period of cultural blending, where new systems of governance were introduced and old traditions were transformed. The legacy of 1066 is one of transformation, adaptation, and resilience. The convergence of Anglo-Saxon and Norman cultures created a new England, one that would go on to influence the development of modern Britain and the wider world. The Norman conquest was more than just a battle. It was a turning point in the history of Britain and Europe, a reminder that change is often born of conflict and struggle.